Hello and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. In this tutorial I'll be teaching you how to create the sun in Blender, or any main sequence star. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, make sure you're in the Cycles render engine, because we will be using that for this tutorial. Make sure you're not using Blender render. Just switch that up here in the drop down menu if it's not already selected. And I'm just going to begin by deleting the default cube and the lamp in the scene. And we're going to go ahead and press Shift A and add an icosphere. And over here in the toolbar on the left, drag this up so we can see it a little bit better, we're going to give this 6 subdivisions to smooth it out, and we don't have to add a subsurf modifier or anything like that. And then I'm just going to click on the Smooth Shading button over here on the left. Alright, and now that the model has been created, the easiest part, we're going to start on the shader. And to begin, I'm going to split my screen by hovering up over the upper right corner there and dragging down. I'm going to hide the timeline too. We don't need that for anything for now. And I'm going to switch the top window here to the node editor, and I'm just going to click New right here to add a new shader. And we'll go ahead and name this Sun. And I'm just going to start by pressing, well, first of all, I'm going to delete this shader right here, and I'm going to replace it by pressing Shift A and adding an emission shader. Because of course the sun will be providing all the light we need in this scene. And I'm just going to move this up, and I'm going to go into the world settings really quickly, enable use nodes for the surface, and we're going to make the background black. And then I'm going to switch this 3D view here from solid to rendered, just so we can sort of keep tabs on how the shader is being updated and whatnot. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is up here in the nodes, we're going to press Shift A, and I'm going to add under layout a frame. We're going to be adding a couple frames just to help organize the node setup, because it's going to get pretty complicated. And I just dragged the emission node into the frame, and we're just going to go ahead and call this, I don't know, we'll call it basic sun shader or something along those lines. Maybe basic sun color. Just something to help keep it straight. Oops, I meant to put that under the label, basic sun color. And we're going to go ahead and give this a color too, again, just so we can sort of help distinguish these. We're going to give it sort of a slight blue tint. Alright, we'll move this over here. So to begin with, we're going to start by changing the color here. We don't want it to be solid white. We want it to be a nice orange color. And I have several hex values prepared in advance for this, just to speed things up a bit. So the key that I used, zoom in here a little bit for this. The key that I use for this first orange color is FF620C. And you can see that's a really nice orange color, sort of what we're looking for. I'm also going to change the strength of this emission shader to 2, make it a little brighter. And we're going to be mixing this with another emission shader. So I'm going to go ahead and press Shift A under Shader, add a mix shader, connect it to that first one there. We'll drop this in the frame as well. And I'm going to duplicate this emission shader then. Move this down. Duplicate is Shift D. We're going to connect this to the second input. And we're going to give this one a slightly different color. We'll make this a little lighter. Basically what we're going to do here is add some very slight, small, bright spots to the basic orange color, just to add a little variation. So the hex key for this that I'll be using is FF9853. You can see that's a little brighter. We'll keep the strength at 2. And to finish this part off, we're actually going to be using a noise texture as the factor, the mix factor. So I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift A under Texture, Noise. We'll drop that in here. And I'm just going to plug this color output right into the factor input of the mix shader. We're going to give this a pretty high scale, something like 75. We'll bring up the detail to something pretty high, like 24. We probably won't need it quite that high, but just in case, so we can zoom in pretty far and still see some nice details. And we're going to give it a little distortion too. So we'll give that maybe 0.8. And what this does is it sort of twists the noise texture into these sort of swirling patterns that make it look a lot more realistic. And as you can see, it's sort of split up the colors, but there's not too much to differentiate them. So the last thing I'm going to do for this is I'm going to press Shift A. Under Color, I'm going to add an RGB Curves node. And we're going to use this to sort of bring up the contrast between them. I'm going to move this first. I'm going to click and drag a point, bring it all the way to the bottom, move it over to about or yeah, about 0.21, somewhere around there. And then I'm going to add another point and move it all the way up to the top and move it, as you can see, the x-coordinate, I'm going to move its x-coordinate over to about 0.37, somewhere around there, 0.37, something like that. And it looks like I've actually mixed up these two shaders here. So if we go back to our mix shader, we can just click and drag the output from this emission shader and drop it in here to switch those around. And now, as you can see, if you zoom in, we've got some very fine, lighter spots that sort of help texture the sun. Now we're going to go ahead and press Shift-A and add another frame. And this frame is going to add sort of the main red textured element. So we'll just call this red texture. Nothing very scientific about this. We're just trying to keep all of these straight. And under the color, we're going to enable the color, bring this all the way up, and we're going to give this sort of a, I don't know, maybe a teal turquoise kind of color. And for this, we're going to add another mix shader. So I'm going to press Shift-A, mix shader in there. I'll make sure that's dropped in. And we're going to connect the previous mix shader to the first input of this. And I'll plug the output back into the surface just so we can sort of see what's going on. And I'm going to press Shift-A and add another emission shader. And we'll go ahead and drop that in here, connect that to there. And we're going to give this a much redder color. This is going to be something around, I think I have A20006. And as you can see, if we sort of zoom in here, that's a nice dark red. We're going to decrease the strength on this one actually to 0.75, so it's not quite as bright as the default emission setting. And we're going to use a noise texture to blend these as well. And for that, I'm just going to select this RGB curves node here. Shift select the noise texture, press Shift-D, duplicate them. Now to remove them from the frame in the background, we can just press Alt-P, which clears the parent. And now you can see they're outside of the frame, and we're free to drop them in our new frame here. We can just plug this color output right into the factor input of the mix shader. Now the only thing we're going to do here is we're going to adjust the RGB curves a bit more, because obviously if we leave it like this, it's way too much red. So for this bottom one, we'll move it up a little bit, maybe something like that, and we're going to move it over to around 0.31, maybe, something like that. Yeah, right about there, so that's up a ways. And then for the other one, the other point in this curve, we're going to move this down a little bit, and we'll move this over to about 0.54-ish on the x-coordinate. So a little farther, something more like that. There we go. All right. And as you can see, this looks much more sun-like in its texture. We have a nice blend between the reds and oranges now. All right. So that's it for that setup. And now we're going to move on to basically creating the outlines for the bright spots. And that's where the bulk of the shader is going to be. Will be in the brighter spots that we'll see at the end here. So I'm going to go ahead and press Shift-A and add another frame. And we'll name this, I don't know, bright spot outline. And we'll give this a color. Bring this up. Again, we'll just sort of work our way around the color wheel. Maybe we'll make this sort of a yellow-green, spring green kind of color. And I'm going to go ahead and add another mix shader. All of these are going to involve mix shaders. And I'm going to zoom in here. And we're going to connect the previous mix shader output into the first input of this mix shader. And again, we'll connect this to the surface output here so we can sort of see what we're doing a little better. I'm going to move this down so we can sort of make this a little bit bigger. And in this, let's see here, I'm going to go ahead and add another emission shader as usual. Shift-A, add an emission shader, drop it right here, connect it to the second input. And we're going to give this an orangey color again, kind of like what we did for the first part. This is going to have a color of about FF620C. You can see it's a nice orange color. And again, we're going to use a noise texture to mix these. So I'm just going to go back to these ones right here. Click, Shift, click, Shift-D to duplicate, Alt-P to clear the parent so we can move them to the other frame over here. And we're going to change something in the noise settings here, actually. We're going to bring the scale way down to about 7. And the reason we're doing this is because the smaller the scale, actually, the greater the noise texture appears. And we want these brighter spots to be much bigger than the fine spot details in the rest of the sun, like in the texture we have here currently. And I'm just going to go ahead and connect that color output into the factor input there. And you can sort of see already that this is much bigger. And the only other thing, again, we're going to change the RGB curves, the position of these. So I'm going to pull this all the way back down to the bottom, bring this one all the way back up to the top. And we'll move this lower one over to an x-coordinate of about 0.48, something like that. Right about there. And then we'll move this top one over to an x-coordinate of around 0.6, 0.63, something like that. Right about there. And so now we can sort of see that we have these nice kind of orange spots, and these are going to serve as the outline for the brighter sunspots. All right, so we have that taken care of. Now we're going to go ahead and add yet another frame, layout frame, and we're just going to go ahead and name this, call it main bright spots. And we'll give this a color. I'll make this maybe an orangish color, something like that. All right, and we'll go ahead and add a mix shader again. Drop that right there. And again, we'll take the previous output and drop it into the first input there. Connect that to the surface input at the end. And of course, we'll be mixing this with another emission shader. So let's go ahead and Shift A, add another emission shader. And we'll drop this in the frame, connect it to the second input there. And this one's going to have a much brighter color. It's not going to be solid white, though. So for this hex value, let's give it something I think I have down here, FFBB67. So it's a much lighter orange color, but not quite white. And we're going to go ahead and give this a strength of 3. So much stronger than either of or any of the emission shaders we've used so far. And of course, we're going to use the noise texture again. Now for this, make sure that you duplicate the noise texture and RGB curves from the bright spot outline, because from here on out we're going to be using the noise texture with a scale of 7 as opposed to 75. So I'm going to have those selected. Go ahead and press Shift D, Alt P to clear the parent, move these over here. And we'll go ahead and connect this color output to this factor input. And as usual, all we're going to do here now is we're going to change the position of the points on the RGB curve. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this top one here. We'll leave it all the way at the top, but we'll move it over to about an x-coordinate of 0.7, something like that. And then for this lower one, we're going to move this up a little bit, just a bit. And we're going to move this over to about 0.61, something like that. Right about there should do. And so now you can see we've got some nice brighter spots in the sun here, and they mesh pretty well with the orange outline we added previously. So we're done with that part. The only other main thing we want to do to these spots is we want to give them some highlights, because they're still a little too dim. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over. We'll go ahead and add yet another frame, and we'll name this bright spot highlights. And again, we'll give this another color. Maybe we'll make this kind of a reddish color, maybe something like that. We'll go back here and adjust this a little bit more so they're a little easier to distinguish from each other. And we'll go ahead and press Shift A and add another mix shader, of course. And we will connect the previous mix shader to the first input in this one. And we're going to go ahead and add another emission shader. Drop that in here, connect that to the second input. And for this one, we're going to give it a hex value of FFD8D3. And again, that's even closer to white, but not quite there. Still leave it with a little bit of orange. And again, we're going to give this a strength of 3. And we are going to continue to use the same noise texture. I'm going to plug this into the surface out here so we can see it better. We're going to duplicate the noise texture and the RGB curves again. Alt-P, clear the parent, drop it in here. And we'll use that as the factor for the mix shader, so connect those. And we're just going to tweak the points in the RGB curves again. So We'll go ahead and move this upper one over to maybe 0.72, so just a little farther over. And then for this one here, the left point here, closer to the bottom, we're going to move this down a bit, probably, and we'll move it over to about 0.68, 0.69, something like that. That's pretty good. And it's a pretty subtle difference, but if we sort of move around here and zoom in on some of these spots, especially the bigger spots, you can see that there is a much brighter, sort of almost white. It may actually be white due to the strength of the emission shader we're using, but it adds a nice highlight to the already pretty bright spots. So the only thing left that we really want to do here is that the spots look nice, but they're not integrated very well with the rest of the sun shader. We could do with maybe breaking them up a little bit with the same texture that's in the background. So to do that, we're going to scroll back out here so we can get a bit of a better view on this. I'm going to add one more frame. Shift-A, go to Layout, add a frame. We will name this, I don't know, Bright Spot Integration. We'll give this a color, and we'll make this, I don't know, kind of a pinkish purple kind of color. And we'll go ahead and add a mix shader. And this is going to be a little different from the other ones. We're not really going to have any noise textures for this or anything like this. We're actually, for this final part of the shader, we're just going to drag the output from the last mix shader, like we always do, into the input for this one. However, instead of adding an emission shader for the second input, we're actually going to go all the way back to the second shader here, or the second part of the shader, the red texture. And we're going to take the output, it's going to be kind of hard to see with how big the node setup is, but the output from the mix shader, from that, all the way into the second input of this mix shader. And we're going to go ahead and plug that into the surface. We don't really see a whole lot of a difference, and that's because we are going to use as the factor for this. Again, this is going to be kind of hard to see with how big the nodes are, but we're going to take the output from the RGB curves in this red texture section and plug it into the factor of that mix node. So we'll go ahead and click and drag that and drop it right in there. All right, and if we zoom in, we can see that now they're much more broken up, but the effect is a bit too extreme. I mean, you can't really see the spots very well anymore. It kind of defeats the purpose. So to remedy that, we're going to actually duplicate this mix shader, Shift-D, and we will keep it in here in the bright spot integration frame. And we'll make sure that the previous mix shader, as you can see here, is connected to the first input and this one. And we are going to mix this with the bright spot highlights portion again. So we're just going to take the output from this mix shader and plug it into the input here. And we're just going to leave the factor at 0.5, basically. And as you can see, if we sort of zoom in on some of these spots, they're much more broken up, and they look like they're integrated more properly. They don't look like they're just sort of pasted on top anymore. They look a little dimmer, but we can fix that in compositing at the very end. Alright, so now that we've completed the shader, which I think is the bulk of the project, we have a little bit of particle systems work to do. And we're going to be simulating sort of a nice fuzzy flame effect over the whole thing, and then working with solar flares at the end of this. So I'm just going to go ahead and go over here to the particle settings on the right, go ahead and click New, and we'll just give this a name. I don't know, we'll call it Fine Flame. It doesn't really matter what we name it. And we're going to go ahead and switch the type from emitter to hair, and check the advanced settings box there. We're going to set the number to something obscenely high, like 500,000, but we'll save that for the end. And of course we're going to, when that comes around, disable it from the viewport so we can still move around and everything perfectly fine. We're going to set the hair length to 0, which may seem counterintuitive at first, but as we move into the more random motion stuff, you'll see why that works out. We're going to uncheck even distribution, and change this from jittered to random. This just helps randomize the particles a bit more so they don't look as straight and as uniform. Under the physics tab right here, we're going to change the size to 0.001, and we're going to bring the, let's see here, leave the random size at 0. I don't think that affects it unless there are actually objects being used. Under Brownian motion, we're going to Set that to 0.015. This is under forces, Brownian. And as you can see now, we've got some particles that are actually showing up here. So we're relying entirely on the randomness of these particles for them to display. And this helps, again, make it less uniform. Looks a lot more natural. And then we're going to move all the way down here to Cycles Hair Rendering. Make sure that's selected. It should be by default. If it's not, make sure you check it. And then all the way down here at the bottom, the Cycles Hair Settings. We're going to leave the shape alone for now. We're going to change the root, though, from 1 to 0.65. And you can't really see any difference in the viewport, but that's just going to make the root of the hair a little thinner. And the scaling, I believe, we will make 0.02. So we'll make that a little bit bigger. And we can't really see a lot of what we're doing here, but it will show up in the render. Currently, this is using our sun shader. We actually want to tweak that a little bit and come up with a slightly special one for the particles. So I'm going to split my view again and change this top window to the node editor. And here we can see our lovely, obscenely complicated sun shader. And we're going to go ahead over here to the right, go back to the material settings or the shader settings, and we're going to click this plus button to add a new shader. We're going to load the sun shader, and we're going to click this little 2 button here to make it a single user. This way we can edit it without it affecting the other sun shader. And we'll rename this particle. And the only difference that I want to make is we want to make sure that the shader sort of fades towards the tips of the particle hairs. And we also want to make it a little more transparent. So I think we might as well just go ahead and I'm going to press Shift-A, add another frame. We'll call this particle. We'll just leave this gray. Particle. And we are going to begin by adding a mix shader, again, as usual. And we'll start by mixing the previous from the bright spot integration, the output from that mix shader will go into the input here, and we'll plug this in out here so we can sort of, I mean, we can't really see what's going on. Maybe if I zoom in here a little bit more, we can see a little better. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Maybe I'll just press Shift-B and, oh, that only zooms you in. All right. So we'll zoom in here so we can see what's going on with these particle hairs a little bit better. And I am going to, let's see here, we will go ahead and mix this with, let's see here, we will go ahead and mix this with a transparent shader, I think. We'll go ahead and press Shift-A, add a transparent shader, because we want this to sort of fade at the tips. But you'll notice if we plug in the transparent shader, it just becomes a little more dim. Nothing really happens to the tips of the particles. And so I am going to press Shift-A, and we're going to use under Input the Hair Info node. And we're going to drop this in here. I'll sort of move this over so we can see a little bit better. And I'm going to use the intercept output and plug that into the factor. And what this will do, I don't know how well it really shows up here in the preview. But basically this is going to help make the tips a little more transparent. And there's one other thing I want to do. I just want to make the thing as a whole a little more transparent. So we're going to duplicate that mix shader, bring it over here, and we're just going to mix that with this transparent shader again, and we will give this a factor of about 0.65. And I just realized why this isn't showing up on the particles. If we go over here to the particle settings, we have to actually tell the particles to use the new shader. So we need to go into the particle settings and come down here under render and switch this from sun to particle. And now you can see, if we zoom in especially, that the tips sort of fade out and they're a little more transparent as a whole. And this is going to look much better when we add all of the particle hairs that we need. So again, like I said, we're going to change this number to 500,000, but that's going to be a ridiculously high number, and it's going to slow down the computer to the point of almost it's not going to be usable. It's not going to be functional in any way. So we're just going to go up here to the particle system, where you see the little camera icon and the eye icon, and we're going to click the eye icon. And what that does is it just hides the particle system from the viewport, but as long as the camera icon is still enabled, it will still render. So that will be it for this particle system. We're going to go ahead and add one more, and we will call this solar flare. And again, we're going to change this from emitter to hair. We'll turn on advanced settings. And we are going to, under emission here, we'll change the number to something a lot less, about 35. We're going to be using children particles for these. And we'll bring the hair length down to about 0.35, 0.36. Looks like a good enough length. And under, let's see here, we're going to uncheck even distribution again and select random, again, to sort of move things around a bit more so they look more organic. We're going to scroll down to velocity. Make sure that the normal is at 0.09. It looks like it was set at that value by default already. I think the hair length affects that. And scrolling farther down, we're going to, like I said before, use children particles in this. So under children, open that tab. We'll switch to simple. And you can see we now have some children particles for each one particle. We want to set the display number to, we'll set that to about 150. We'll set the render to 350. If this is too much for your computer to handle, you can always lower the display number to something lower. And we're going to tweak a couple settings here to sort of bring them closer together and increase the variety. We're going to bring this random all the way up to 1. It didn't look like it did much, but it did do something. And we're going to come down here to the clump settings. And we're going to, right here, under use clump curve, under effects, we're going to change the clump value to 0.2. And that sort of clumps the tips together there, as you can see. And then we're going to adjust the second random value, make it about 0.1. And that gives some nice waviness and randomness to the particles. And the only other things we want to do here are we want to go down to the radius towards the bottom. We want to give that 0.015, and this moves these particles much closer together, as you can see. And we are going to give this some sort of random seed value. It doesn't matter, just to sort of spruce things up again. And for this last part, we're going to have to pick a camera angle that we want to basically produce the sun in. So I'm just gonna do the front view right here, 1 on the number pad. Press Control-Alt-0 to move the camera to that view. I'm gonna right-click the camera to select it. I'm gonna go to the camera settings too. You want to make sure you adjust the focal length to something really high. We'll say like 200. And then I'm gonna press G, middle mouse button, sort of move it back out. The reason we're doing this, of course, is because the perspective would not be nearly that apparent on an object as huge and as distant as the sun. And the only thing left to do to complete these solar flares is we're going to right-click the sun, and we're actually going to, under here where it says object mode towards the bottom, we're going to switch to particle edit, and we're actually going to comb these particle hairs into these shapes that we want. This is mostly a matter of preference. Make sure you have the comb setting selected, and you can just start clicking and dragging and creating the shapes for your solar flares. Make sure some of these have some sort of arches to them. Maybe some of them are sort of pushed inward a bit. Kind of create some interesting shapes here. Let's see. And that'll probably do. We'll go back into object mode to see how this looks. That's not too bad. We'll go back into particle edit. This one's kind of sticking out a little weird. Go back to object mode, and that'll probably work. That will probably work well enough. One more last little tweak here, just that one. And it is complete. So we'll want to go back to the particle settings right now, and under render again, we want to switch again the shader that it's using from sun to particle to make sure that is the one it's using. But other than that, that is it for the particle settings. Alright, so now that the particle systems have been completed, this is what the final render looks like. Zoom in a little bit so we can see it a little better. I realized after I ended that last segment I forgot to actually set the number of particles in our first particle system, the fine flame system, to 500,000. Make sure you do that before you render it. And at this point the only thing left that we have to do is compositing. So I'm going to go up here under where it says default, the scene layout. We're going to switch to compositing. I'm going to go ahead and merge these windows just to clear up a little more space. I'll press N to hide that bar on the right, and I'll click Use Nodes and Backdrop so we can sort of see what we're doing here. And we'll drag these out a bit. Press Shift A, and under Output, we will add a Viewer node. And I will connect the image output to the image input there, so we have a nice backdrop and we can see what we're doing. So the purpose of this is to add some basic glow, and we're also going to give it a nice red halo effect, which you see in a lot of photos of the sun. So to begin, we're going to go ahead, we have our render layer right here, our original image, and I am going to press Shift A, we'll go to Color, and add a Mix node, and make sure that the image output is connected to the first image input here. And basically we're going to start out by adding the halo. So I'm going to press Shift A, and we will add an RGB curves node and connect the image output to the first image input on this. And I'm going to plug this image output straight into the viewer node so we can sort of see what we're doing here. The goal here for this RGB curves node is to really bring out the red in the sun. So I'm going to switch over to the red tab here and bring the red all the way up, something really high like this, and then bring down the green a bit, bring down the blue a bit. So we have something that's very strikingly red. And after that, we're going to press Shift A, go to Filter, Blur, connect this so that the image output from the curves node is connected to the image input on here. And we're going to switch this from Gaussian to fast Gaussian. And we're going to give this a size of, we'll say, 35 by 35. And we are going to then plug this image output into the second image input on our mix node. Connect this over here. We're going to change the factor to about 0.25. And we're going to change the type from mix to screen, which, as you can see, is a much brighter overlay than mix. And you can sort of already see a red halo and glow kind of starting to appear from this. But we want to take this a little bit further. We want to give it some distortion and really make it spread out more. So we're going to go ahead and we will take, let's see here, I believe we are just going to use this RGB curves node, and we're going to plug it into, if we press Shift A under Distort, we will add a Translate node, and we will connect this RGB curves to the Translate node. And then I'm going to duplicate that Translate node and connect the RGB curves to that one as well. So what we're going to do here is we're basically going to translate this. We're going to shift it up and down, and then we're going to combine the shifted textures using a noise texture. And that will give it that will break it up nicely and add much needed variation. So for this first Translate node, we'll make this, we'll say 25 by 15. And if we can sort of plug that in here, we can see we shifted the whole thing up. And if we take a look at the next one, we'll make this negative 25 by, we'll say 10. So we'll shift it up, but not quite as much. And you can see the translation's taking effect here. I'm going to reconnect that. And I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift A, Color, Mix, and we will connect this first translate to the first input, the second translate to the second input. We will connect that to the viewer node so we can follow what's going on. If we press 0.5, we can sort of see them overlapping. And what we want to do here is we want to create a quick noise texture that we will use to combine these. So we're going to go ahead and press Shift A. Under Input, we will add a texture. And we can't really work with anything here until we go over here to the texture panel. We want to switch this from Noise Texture 003 to Brush. And we'll go ahead and add a new brush texture. We're not going to be using a brush, but this is the most efficient way to create a texture that can actually be loaded by the texture node over here. So we're going to change the type from image or movie to clouds. And we're going to go ahead and we'll bring up the depth a bit. We'll leave the size where it's at. Under colors, turn on ramp. And let's bring these, just by clicking and dragging these bands closer to each other to really help separate this. We're just going to go ahead and load that texture there in the texture node and plug that color into the factor. And now you can see, if we look closely, it's really broken it up and provided some very interesting patterns there. Next we're going to, let's take this blur node that we used earlier, Shift D to duplicate it and bring it down over here. And we will let's change this so that it's not quite as intense, maybe 30 by 30. And then we will duplicate our screen node, plug that into that input, and then plug in the blur to the second input. Plug this into the viewer node so we can see what's going on again. We'll leave it as screen, but we will cut that factor in half. We'll make it 0.125 instead of 0.25. And so that's added even more variation to the red glow, as you can see. Now there's some sort of wavy patterns in the outside of it. The last thing I want to do is we want to sort of make it maybe a little bit brighter, give it a little bit more glow. These are just final tweaks, all a matter of preference really at this point. So I'm just going to go ahead and add another mix node. Go ahead and Shift-A, Color, Mix. And I'm going to add a brightness and contrast node. So we'll go to Color, Brightness and Contrast, plug that in there. I'll bring that factor down to 0 for now so we can sort of see what we're doing here. And I'm going to bring this contrast up to 2. And the reason I'm doing this is sort of, as you can see, it sort of brings out more saturation in the image, a little more bite. And I am then going to, let's see here, we will duplicate this blur node again. And I'm going to connect this RGB curves node to this new blur node that we just duplicated. So I will click and drag that over here. And we're going to give this a much bigger value, something like 150 by 150, because this is the final sort of all-encompassing glow. And we will plug this into the second input here. And I'm going to change the type from mix to add. And we will give it a very subtle factor, about 0.065 is the value that I had used before. And you can see it sort of added a nice, even warmer glow around what's already there. And we can then go ahead and plug the add output right into the image input there. And once that's finished, we can go back to default, take a look at our viewer node here, and that's the final result. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot from it. I'd love to see what you come up with as a result of following it. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.